Hi, we're Option Conservation, and this is the Shoe Room Sessions. Not your first podcast? You've done a few of these?
I've done a few, yeah. I always, Kun Van Sagen, who does a regenerative agriculture podcast series. I've been in his a few times, so that's
fascinating.
Yeah.
What does regenerative agriculture mean to you?
I think regenerative agriculture, it's a way of farming land which produces the food material we need while also building soil health, storing carbon, being good for biodiversity, so delivering on natural capital outcomes as well. So it's trying to really balance production with nature in a way that's truly sustainable over the long term.
That's such a lovely, simple and accessible definition. Perfect. You should probably tell people who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So my name is Paul McMahon. I'm one of the co-founders and managing partner of SLM Partners. We are an asset management firm. Our mission is using capital to scale up regenerative agriculture and forestry systems. We raise money through funds and separate accounts. We invest in land, so typically in farmland and forest land, partnering with local farmers and foresters to implement these more ecological land management approaches. We've been going for 15 years and we manage about $750 million in assets at the moment.
It's incredible. I appreciate it'll be a long and winding story, but can you give us the short version of how the business came about and that founding chapter?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Ireland. I grew up in Dublin. I did a PhD in history, worked as management consultant for a few years, did a lot of different things. Got increasingly into this in impact, though, both social, environmental impact, and particularly climate change. This was about 2007, 2008. Joined a company in London called Climate Change Capital back then, and they were looking to address climate change. But I was hired onto a team that was looking at land through a climate change lens. And that led us to quite interesting conclusions because we saw, both agriculture and forestry as a major source of emissions, a big cause the climate change is the problem, but also the huge potential for land to act as a carbon sink and to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And we got quite excited because we were finding great foresters and farmers on the ground who were actually implementing these regenerative systems and doing it in a profitable way, and they needed to scale. And we thought there was a need and an opportunity for a capital partner to come in and provide the capital to help them scale up and expand activities. So we set up SLM Partners in around 2009, and we've been building the business ever since, piece by piece.
So you got there early in terms of that market, because I finished PhD 2008-9, literally at the point of the financial crisis, which would have been the same time you were looking at setting up. That must have been an interesting conversation when you wanted to start a new sort of capital-heavy business immediately after a financial crisis.
Yeah, very difficult. And I took some time off. I wrote a book about the global food systems. I had plenty of time for side projects. We kind of let the storm abate a little bit, but then we spent that time doing research, putting together a kind of a strategy. We'd find some local partners, and we began actually focusing on Australia. We raised a fund focused on grass-fed beef, so pasture-raised livestock, using regenerative grazing systems to restore grasslands, and to put the materials together. And then we went out on the road, and it took a couple of years to raise the capital, but we found some pension funds in Europe to back us, and we were able to get going. But yeah, the first fundraise is always the hardest, and then it never gets easy, but it just gets a little bit less hard each time after that.
Have you? It sounds like you've always had such a wide array of interests because you've spanned everything from history to economics to land to food systems. You ever thought about why such a range of interest and topics?
I get bored easily. Always intellectually curious, and I mean, climate change is probably the original motivator, the theme that kind of tied it all together, because it's realizing that was one of the major issues of our generation.
Do you know why, of all the issues that could have grabbed you, do you know why climate change did?
Maybe just doing the reading, and diving into the research, and just seeing what a sort of powerful arguments were being made around the importance of this issue. It was very hard once you've kind of read that research and have that understanding. It's very hard to then close your eyes to it and sort of turn the direction. So I felt, well, I got to do something about this. So I think that was the initial motivator, or the impulse to kind of dive in. But then I think quite quickly it was actually meeting these land managers on the ground, like getting stuck in and meeting farmers and foresters who were doing these amazing things, and they opened my eyes to the ability to manage land in different ways and doing it good for the environment and profitable ways as well. So, and that really sort of kickstarts everything, because you want to find ways to help them and help them grow and access more land and impact more land.
And farming was in your background in Ireland?
No, no. My mother's side did come from a farming background, the west of Ireland, but I grew up in sort of boring suburban Dublin. So the only interaction with farming was basically to everyone telling me don't go near because it makes no money in small, kind of more traditional farms in the west of Ireland.
Didn't put you off though?
No, no. I think yes. I think I had a windy route to get here, but once I just kind of found this sort of theme and was bitten by the bug, I saw there's a lot to it. Let's kind of stick with it. And we were quite early, so there weren't too many people working on this. So it really felt it needed some time and energy and attention to try and get this story out into the world about regenerative agriculture and forestry.
We've had quite a few similar chapters in terms of PhDs, publishing books, raising funds. None of those three things are easy, and they're not fast either. So I did not enjoy my PhD. I did a PhD to play sport and then realized I had to write a book. Where do you find your resilience and your ability to dig deep and push through? Because each of those things is a long period of time. And I always remember writing up my PhD and my now in-laws were like, it's Christmas Day, you're not going to stop. And I'm like, this doesn't stop until I'm done. This doesn't go away until I'm finished. Yeah. Where does your resilience come from?
I suppose stubbornness, pig-headedness. I don't know, once you set yourself on a certain path, you want to see it through and you just keep chipping away. It's one thing I've learned in life, like you just keep chipping away, eventually it'll happen, you know, and it might take 3 years rather than 6 months. It almost certainly does take 3 years rather than 6 months. But if you just keep plugging away and you go about it in the right way, you'll probably get there, you know. So and yeah, don't just give up, you know, the first sort of like bump in the road.
I think almost your description about how the first raise is the hardest and it's never easy, but it gets easier. I think it's a bit like that in terms of overachieving something that's difficult. Once you keep pushing through and do the first one, you've proven to yourself, okay, if I really lean into this and work really hard, I can get the next one and the next one. So I was really fortunate to captain the Great Britain American football team out in the USA. And I was the worst player on the team athletically, but I just outworked everyone else.
Right.
And that was the one for me that it was like, okay, I don't deserve to be here on talent. The only way I'm going to stay here is if I work incredibly hard. Yeah. And I think that sort of early 20s was when it clicked for me. Do you remember when that hard work clicked for you and the importance of it?
Probably my third year of university, because I spent the first 2 years messing around, dossing around.
Yeah, me too.
And not achieving very much. And then I took a year off, actually. And I did a lot of quite crap jobs. And I lived in Berlin for 5 months.
What was the worst job you did?
Back then, well, I started cleaning toilets in my school. That's probably the very worst. But I'd graduated by then, I think, to working in a video store. It wasn't the worst. And maybe, I think, a petrol station as well. So nothing terrible.
I like bad job top trumps.
Yeah.
So like I put fences up around a storage farm in the middle of summer. My worst one was me and 5-day release prisoners scraping oil off railway lines at Scunthorpe Steelworks because it was cheaper than it being done mechanically by them. So literally on hands and knees scraping oil off these character building.
Yeah, I did work in a building site in Krefeld in Germany where we were the lowest skilled workers. So everyone else was like carpenters and like brickies, they had trays, they knew what they were doing. We were just the kind of the students at low levels. All we do was pick up rubbish basically and put it in.
Like building sites in summer. At least it was like manual stuff. The one job I did quit was there was a caravan door factory near where, so I was brought up in the northeast of England, below Lincolnshire way. It's not very interesting, nothing happens there. And you were literally scraping excess glue off the back of caravan doors. You weren't allowed earphones. That's the only job I ever quit. Right. I just couldn't cope with like the mental stimulation of it. It was just horrific.
Yeah, well, building sites, something's always happening. But I think like taking that year off, doing lots of other jobs, kind of messing around a bit, I sort of realized this is not how I want my life to go. Yeah. So I came back my following year at university, and I had a kind of fire in me. I was like completely serious. I studied hard. I got good grades. So if I hadn't taken that year off, who knows? I might have dossed away the last year and ended up in a very different direction. So I think just sort of, and then seeing if you put your mind to it, spend a year getting like quite good marks, and that got me into like scholarships and into PhDs, and then sort of set me on a bit of a course. So
compounds, right?
Yeah.
One of my, I just wrote a piece about how, I don't think it's been released yet. I think everything compounds. The bad decisions you make compound and follow you. The good ones, the positive. The evening as a student, you don't go out, you study instead. It makes you better for the next day and the next day. So I think in life, decisions compound.
Yeah.
When you, I'm also interested about, you mentioned the difficulties of that first raise. What was it that kept you In fact, no, not what was kept you going. What were the highlights as you started to do the raise? What were the achievements that gave you the boost to go on to the next one in the early days of the business?
Yeah. Well, it's probably discovering this regenerative grazing movement and the kind of pioneers of that system. A lot of us trace back the ideas of a man called Alan Savory, who really was a visionary. He's now, I think, in his late 80s, a white Rhodesian who had come up with these ideas studying the behavior of actually wild grazing animals in Africa, and then applied that to grazing systems, had gone to America and had gone to Australia. And we partnered with a couple of individuals in Australia who were really experts in this grazing system.
And was that an existing connection you had, or how did that connection come about?
It was, we were introduced by someone who knew we were looking for kind of regenerative farmers. So it was one of these sort of random serendipitous things. But we partnered with a few people in Australia who opened our eyes to this sort of worldwide movement, actually, how you could take somewhat like degraded pasture land, and through changing management, by putting animals in bigger moths, by moving them, by investing in fencing, water, you could have this really positive impact in grasslands. And it was good for production, it was good for profitability, it was good for the land, it was good for carbon. It was just this win-win-win across the board. It was, this is fantastic, let's try and scale it up. And every time we'd come back for another fundraising tour in Europe with no success, just spending a bit of time with those guys on the ground actually doing it, and actually getting out on the farm as well, and just seeing the impacts on the ground. Like that's what gets you motivated again to go back, and keep trying.
So that's been successful for you over the last 15 years. Do you view that side of the business and regenerative agriculture, has that changed quickly, or do you think it's still changed really slowly? From your unique perspective, how do you think the way we looked at agriculture has changed over that time period?
I think the awareness of regenerative agriculture as a theme, a concept, is completely changed. Because 15 years ago, when we were doing this, no one was really talking about it. It was a really subculture of a movement within actually the farming sector, and certainly was not talked about in the finance world almost at all. So just explaining what this idea was, what ecological farming, regenerative agriculture, all these different sort of terms, that took a lot of time. What we've seen over the last 5 years is complete coin flip, actually, where suddenly it's become quite a sexy topic, regenerative agriculture, and everyone's using it. That creates its own risks around both sort of greenwashing and overhyping, which maybe we can get into. But that's been a massive change, in the interest in this whole concept. So it's been fascinating to see that over the last 10, 15 years develop.
Where you reference those particularly skilled and engaged land managers, be it farmers or foresters, have you found a consistent feature as to those who think in a regenerative mindset? What are some of the commonalities they have? Because it's not all people working in that sector. There's others that are wedded to the industrialized and heavy impact version of doing it.
Yeah. Sometimes there's been a jolt. Often, they've experienced a jolt. You look at some of those famous regenerative farmers, maybe they've reached rock bottom, actually, and they've sort of seen the dead end, which is the more high input conventional farming system they were using, and they had no choice but to try something new. So they themselves have had a jolt out of the norm, and they had to seek out new ways. But I think there's also just a philosophical mindset there, where they tend to be just very open-minded to see things in a more holistic way, to be capable of balancing multiple factors, social, economic, environmental, and thinking very, very long term, and seeking this harmony with nature. It's like sort of fuzzy, new agey kind of feel to it, but they do view the world in a different way. And whether it's a forester, expert in continuous cover forestry in Ireland we work with, or our grazing partner in Australia, they actually, even though it's completely different systems, if you put them together in a room, I think they'd find a lot of overlap and commonality.
When you're thinking about an investment, what proportion of the decision is based on the landscape and what is based on that person and that partner?
Yeah. So we come at it a few different angles. So we do a lot of top-down research, looking at particular geographies and then particular sectors of, let's say, farming or forestry, where there is an investable case, and that's not everywhere, because some places maybe you're not allowed by land, maybe for good reason, or it's too expensive, or you're growing a crop which is not very economic and there's no real good return. So there's a certain amount of top-down analysis to find.
In that level, are you factoring in climate risk to those decisions as well?
Yep, climate risk and production potential, and a lot of different things go into that. So it is an interesting sector, but then we very quickly flip over to, can we find great farmers or foresters who actually are doing things in a regenerative ecological way, who've proven it at a certain scale, and we can help scale it up. So it very quickly flips over, and we have what's called a farmer first approach, in particular in agriculture, where we actually now don't invest until we found that partner on the ground. For example, what we do in the US, we have quite a large program investing in organic farmers, where we acquire land, we enter into long-term 10-year leases with those farmers on flexible terms, and we basically give them access to more land. But we never do an investment until we found the farmer first, and we work with them to find the land. So we never do investment without the farmer in place.
Perfect. That's interesting. And do you ever move a farmer from a different geography to a place?
Typically not. We found farmers tend to be quite locally rooted, for good reason. And that's the ecosystem, but it's also, to be honest, the community relationships in the marketplace as well. So they tend to get very place-based, and that's probably a good thing. So, for example, in the US, the organic grain farmers who work with the Midwest, they might manage land within a 25-mile radius of home base, but they don't want to go beyond that because it just gets too inefficient to move machinery, and they don't know it. So, we find more go to where the farmer is and then work with them to find land around them.
I adore that. That's wonderful. It's I like a sporting analogy with these type of things, and it's a bit like you can have the most skilled footballer or rugby player in the world, but if you ask them to play in a different system that doesn't support them, it's not going to work. So what you're able to do is you're keeping someone in their system, and you're keeping them in the most efficient way of working possible. I mean, if someone's like a second, third, fourth generation farmer in a geography, you cannot hope to replicate those relationships. They know who can fix machinery and who the top 3 people to provide something to the farm is and things like that. So it's so efficient to keep them operating in their environment.
Yeah, I think, and often the best farmers, they don't want to be employees. They're basically entrepreneurs. They're amazingly skilled people because they have to know how to understand soil science. They got to some agronomy. They got to understand weather. They got to understand machinery. They got to understand how to manage a team, markets, how to sell crops, how to deal with regulators. They're tech entrepreneurs, startup.
They're an MD of a business,
fundraising, CFO, all rolled into one person.
Yeah.
And so the best people really have that entrepreneurial spirit, and they don't want to go and work for someone else. So if you want to find the best farmers, you kind of got to go to them and see how you can become their partner.
I adore that model. So I'm going to ask you both sides of this equation. What are the 1 or 2 things where you see that farmer, you're immediately like, they're one for us? What gets you the most excited in terms of talent?
And we have a sort of due diligence process. We have to kind of turn into a bit of a dry process, but we're looking for a few things. Like, one is just, what are they farming now? We're not working with typically new farmers, so they always have a certain amount of experience. So we look at what they're doing at the moment. What's their current scale? Have they sort of proven they can handle it? So it's where are they now is looking at the practices they use. So are they really using regenerative, organic, ecological farming practices? And then we're looking at their commercial, let's say, abilities too. Are they profitable? Do they have a strong balance sheet? And then probably the last is their willingness to partner, because some farmers are very happy doing it on their own and they don't want to partner with a group like ours, but others are very keen to partner because they see that's a really efficient way for them to scale, and they have that ambition to scale and to get onto more land.
And then on the land side of things, so you found your partner, what are some of the key things on that due diligence list on the land itself in terms of the ecology of it already?
Yeah, so partly it's the quality of the land and the quality of the soils, the productive potential for whatever it is, the system we're investing in, whether it's organic grains, or is it permanent crops for nuts and olives, is it grazing? So you're analyzing the productive capacity of the land itself. You're looking at where it is, and access to markets and infrastructure is also very important, and values are also very important. You're looking at the economics of this, like, is it going to pencil out and produce a decent return both for the farmer and for our investors?
And that process, where's the balance between on the ground investigation and monitoring of the land versus a GIS based data analytical approach? How do you balance those 2 aspects?
I'd say the desktop GIS analysis is initial screening, but we always visit the land. Like, we always have boots on the ground, and we're spending a lot of time, usually alongside that farmer, our farmer partner, kind of due diligencing the land together and working, does this make sense?
Love it. Do you often get out and see the sites?
Not as much as I'd like, but yeah, I always do a kind of a tour. But we're active in the USA, we're active in Europe, we're active in Australia, so there is quite a lot to cover. But yeah, I do this sort of annual migration as much as I can.
And is Ireland still home for you?
No, I'm based in New York at the moment,
based
in the US. Yeah.
How do you manage the geographies and the travel and the time zones? So we're currently purely UK based. It won't be that way for much longer. What's your advice about how best to manage multiple geographies, multiple time zones?
What we've done is build quite distinct regional investment teams who sort of run their geographies fairly independently, I'd say. And then we have a pretty light corporate center who kind of support where needed, whether that's for capital raising or some impact measurement reporting we do, or there's some common principles and systems of process, but we try to build independent teams and let them get on with it as much as possible. I think that's critical.
So you closest to the US team with you being out there?
I would say I'm in between everything at the moment. Yeah, even though I'm physically in New York, I do come to Europe a lot. I'm in Australia once or twice a year as well. So I at different times I would be close to up teams. So when we're getting something going and starting and building a team, that's where I'm putting all my energies. At the moment, we have quite a stable US team. We have a lot of capital and fundraising. It's just growing really nicely. We're putting a lot of effort into Europe at the moment, raising new funds, putting new strategies together. So probably put a lot of effort into Europe just right now.
And how big are you in terms of number of people?
About 17 people.
Okay, that's a lot of geography to cover with 17. It's really impressive.
Yeah.
Where do you see the biggest opportunity at the moment in terms of either geography or style of investment? In fact, both. Let's look at that Venn diagram. Yeah. Geography, where's the biggest opportunity, and which style of investment?
Look, I think there's opportunity everywhere we're active in the USA, Europe, Australia. One area we're focusing on.
Of course you do, because your mentality is what next?
Yeah. But one area we're just, so the near-term focus for us, we are about to launch a European Forestry Fund. That's one thing we've put a lot of our work into recently. We already manage a fund investing in Ireland, trying to use something called continuous cover forestry, a more sustainable type of forest management system. We're now trying to expand that by launching a bigger pan-European forestry fund, which will invest in multiple European countries, but very much the same strategy. So that's one thing we hope to get going before the end of this year.
And will the continuous coverage, is that what gives you the point of differentiation from other forestry funds?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And and what we see when we look at forestry in Europe, on the one hand, there's a lot of fragmented forests out there which have been undermanaged and neglected. And it's partly because they're very small, and so it can sometimes be uneconomic and to manage them individually. So there's probably a need for some aggregation.
What is the scale that you would look to bring together? What's a minimum sort of ticket?
In Ireland, the minimums were about 10 hectares, let's say. We average a little bit more. Depends where you go in Europe, but yeah, we're willing to buy relatively small properties and build portfolios. So
with our acquisition strategy in Scotland, will be circa 10,000 acres minimum, and in England or Wales, near as 1,000 as we can.
Yeah.
That's really. I thought you were going to say much bigger in terms of the number.
No, in Ireland, for example, over the last 6 years, we bought about 80 different properties, forest properties. We built a portfolio of about 2,000 hectares. And so it takes a lot of work, but that's the opportunity actually in Europe, is aggregating these fragmented pieces, putting them together a portfolio, and then you have the economies of scale and you can bring professional management. So that's one thing we're doing, is the aggregation. But the second is really trying to change the management, because when we look at forestry in Europe, especially in the UK and Ireland, you see a lot of monoculture plantations, a lot of citrus spruce managed on a clear fell rotational basis. You plant the trees, you thin a few times, you wait, you chop it all down, and you repeat every 30, 40 years. And that can be quite destructive. It's bad for soils, release a lot of carbon. It's not good for biodiversity.
When someone hasn't seen a clear-felled forest and you tell them it's sustainable forestry, it looks horrific, right? The damage that's done after. We've visited 100 estates over the last 4 years to buy the 12 we have, because we were building our modelling and approach and our assessment mechanism and stuff. So lots early, fewer now. If we go see, we probably buy 1 in 3 we go see now. But you will often drive past a clear-felled entire hillside, and it is stark.
Yeah, it's like the Battle of the Somme.
It is, yeah.
And you can see why, if you live around those forests, like you're angry. Like, it's not what you want to see when you look at your kitchen window, at the hillside, which is just being kind of destroyed in that way. So I think that's why forestry gets a bit of a bad rap at times, and there's a lot of societal opposition to forestry, and even a lot of environmental NGO opposition to forestry, even though it should be the greenest form of land use.
We had Richard Kelly from Foresight on the podcast. Love Richard, he's great, spoke wonderfully. I got some stick from the wider conservation sector for having a forester on the podcast. And I was like, sorry, now hold on, this guy's done something wonderful. I don't know if you know much about Foresight's model, but they were the first to put a carbon based portfolio on the stock exchange, and then have taken it into a different ownership model. And they've done some amazing things. And we're not foresters. We do not do sort of productive timber or forestry in that way. But I do recognise we need more native UK grown timber if we're going to have better use of building materials and things. My view was there's tons we can learn from Richard and we'll share it. But some people get very zealoty about their way of improving the environment and only want it to be that way.
Completely, yeah. And you see it in forestry, where there's some people only want to support established and say native woodland, which is great, really good for biodiversity, pretty good for carbon, but isn't going to produce an awful lot of timber, which we do need to build buildings and furniture and sort of power societies and economies as well. But we think there's a way you can balance, the different functions of forestry, where you can have forests which will deliver commercial timber, but will also store carbon, be good for biodiversity, and look good too, and have that aesthetic and amenity value. So it'll be popular in local communities. So it's trying to look at forestry in this multifunctional way and optimize across the different.
Would you acquire land that had built property on it as well, or do you exclusively?
Very rarely. No, we tend not. It gets complicated, and I think our strategy so far we try to avoid it. I think in the future we may do that, but I think you almost need a different team and different expertise, which we don't have yet.
We had a hypothesis that it wasn't ideal to have the built property footprint when we started. Actually, my learnings now, virtually all our sites do have a built footprint, but that allows us to provide a home to the estate manager and the team running the estate and things like that, and increasingly provide an ecotourism component to what we do. So this year we'll have about 2,000 visitors across our portfolio. And actually, I think the disproportionate impact on the business, on the team, on everyone, and on the investors of being able to visit, interact. The investment group now will say, oh, where can we stay when we go? From originally being like, oh, do we want property? Whereas we bought some estates without property they can stay at, and they don't like it now because they want to be able to visit. And actually, people talk to us more about the ecotourism side of it than they do any other part of the business, because it's the vehicle that allows them to imagine themselves there. So I think if you end up having a couple of bothies here, there, and everywhere, you do need a different team. It is a different team and a different dynamic. And I would say for us, it's not a significant revenue generator, but it is a wonderful connection piece, storytelling part of what we do. What do you think about the US as a place to buy and acquire land at the moment under the leadership of Mr. Trump?
Yeah, I mean, we're heavily investing in the US. Like, of our $750 million we manage, about $500 million is in the US. We have some quite big capital partners there and big pools of capital, and we're doing investments every week actually at the moment in the Midwest around organic grains, also the West Coast around organic permanent specialty crops, so nuts and olives and citrus and a whole range, berries, a whole range of things. Now, I think, and I live in the US, so I sort of see what's happening. And you have
how long have you been out there now?
I mean, on and off for 20 years.
Wow, okay.
But you have the political level where you may not agree, a lot of things are going on, but below that, most things sort of continue on, And for example, we're growing for the organic marketplace. That's still quite strong, actually. US consumers still want organic food. They want healthy food. They want pesticide-free food. So the demand is still there. The pricing is still good. And so the dynamics on the ground actually haven't changed that much. So we're continuing to invest.
I think it's a great time in the US. I think it's the best time because I also think it's a bit like the loss of the letters ESG on things. My view is we just don't need them anymore. There used to be a moniker that required you to have a conversation, but now, so how many people were downstairs in the conference today, do you think?
About 100 maybe.
100 people. I doubt there's anyone in the room that doesn't think appropriate governance should be in place and investment should be resilient and sustainable. No one's going to disagree with that. You don't need the letters anymore.
Yeah.
So I think stripping them away and just saying, well, we're making sensible investments that are in the right way. I just think it's a language that's lost in that way. And I think there's a big opportunity for people. And that's why I'm really bullish about, I would like to start looking at opportunities now in the US, because I think it's the right time to go.
Yeah. No, and like all the investments we make, we're not sacrificing return. Like, we actually think we can get higher returns by investing in, say, regenerative agriculture, ecological forestry. We published a couple of white papers recently on the topic. We call it the regenerative edge. You're getting more return for land. And why is that? Maybe because you could be growing a higher yielding product. You could be increasing yields, by better management. That's one way. You could be reducing costs, especially input costs, reducing fertilizer use or chemical use, growing your margin that way. You could be getting a higher price, and that's where the organic marketplace is a good example of that. There's some very strong organic premiums. Or you're monetizing some new dimensions. Could it be carbon, could be biodiversity, such as the work you guys are doing. So you get new revenue streams. You put it all together, you should be making more money, not less. So you can sell this as a purely financial investment, and the financial return is driven by the ecological understanding. It's not a trade-off of one against the other.
100, love every single word of that. I completely agree. We actually have... we're not farmers. We have a farming component of what we do, but not in the same way that you do. It's not the principal usage of a land parcel we have. One of our investments is 2/3 of a 17th generation family farm. Hello, Kate and David. and we fell in love with the family. We went to see it, loved them. They needed to transition out of the existing ownership structure for inheritance reasons and things like that. Mum and dad moving away, son and his wife taking on the farm. And we ended up partnering with them and took the land organic immediately, fully regenerative systems. Dad has gone through such a journey, very traditional farmer. John is the most amazing man, the man I hope to grow up to be one day. He's just a joy. But seeing him sort of question his own practices with David, his son, going, this is what I was telling you about soil, Dad, and we need to change this and that. You can see him going on that whole journey. But as a result of the changes with us, they had their first profitable year in like 10. Yields were way down, but just the saving of the cost on the chemical side of things just absolutely gave them a profitability. And what's super exciting is, so we've put in 180 acres of new woodland, connecting up historic woodland bits, a bit like the aggregation you talked about. And they described for the first time in their family's history, this might give them a pension through a carbon route. So we've literally got a wonderful case study of everything you've just described there.
Yeah.
Love you guys. Thank you. Where am I going to go next? One of the things we're experiencing is we're the first people at scale to do the thing we're doing in the UK. And as a result of that, every day now we're hitting something that the systems and the process and the regulations just don't account for, because they didn't expect anyone to put together 50,000 acres in 3 years. You must have had so many of those things because you were the first people to be really looking at this. What are some of the regulatory hurdles, the challenges, the difficulties you encountered, and how did you solve those?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us and what slowed us down is more on the capital raising side, actually, is finding investors who have allocations for our sectors, who are willing to get behind what we're doing. You know, I think that's been the longest and hardest journey, because
what is the pot that would be the nearest? Where's the allocation that you're accessing?
So at the moment, and that's the challenge, because traditionally a lot of investors would not invest in farmland or forestry. Those who have a allocation to private markets. Within that, they might have allocation to real assets, and they'll have infrastructure and they'll have real estate. And then some of them, maybe the more enlightened ones, are adding, let's say, farmland, forestry, or natural capital as a new asset allocation. You know, within that, it might only be 2%, 3% of their total assets. But it's when investors done the homework and gone through that process, made the allocation, then we can really talk. But I'd say that's probably maybe 1 in 10 investors have actually taken all the steps and got to that point. I would have said 10 years ago, maybe it's 1 in 20. So the numbers increase, but it's still a very niche sector, you know. And so that's probably been the biggest hurdle. It's just, I think we develop good strategies, we build good teams, we have opportunity, but then the time it takes to raise capital probably slowed us down. On the regulatory policy side, that hasn't really been an issue, I would say. You know, I think on things like, you know, probably because we're investing in productive land where the returns come from growing crops or timber or, you know, commodities effectively are being sold. Carbon, things like carbon and BNG, you know, the voluntary carbon markets have been somewhat frustrating. And I'd say in Australia, we've gone heavily into that. And I say it's been a very much a positive, where a regulated carbon market evolved, and we never really modeled it. It was always a sort of upside in the model. And the market evolved. The government created quite a good regulated system. We were able to jump in it. And we've generated and sold 1.8 million tons of CO2 credits in Australia over the last 10 years.
Congratulations.
So that's fantastic. Whereas if you look at the US and Europe, agriculture carbon is way behind. You know, it's a bit of a mess. It's, you know, it's very complicated. Different soil carbon schemes. There's no real rules.
And in Australia, that's soil carbon that you're selling.
It's mostly above ground. It's in more regeneration of native woodlands, actually. But you had a regulated market or approved methodologies from the government, and now also sources of demand, which have been created. So it's a really good case study of how to prime the pump and get a carbon market.
So you've got integrated the ability to sell in a nature-based offset into a regulated system, whereas in the UK at the moment you can't yet.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the rest of the UK, Europe and USA is a voluntary system, lots of methodologies, different levels of integrity and rigor around it, and the source of demand are maybe less clear as well. So I think, and then on the forestry side, we're starting to see that change in a little bit in Europe and US now, thankfully, where we're seeing the development of very approved carbon schemes for afforestation and improved forest management. So we're quite bullish actually on carbon, let's say in forestry in Europe now and the future. But up until this point, you couldn't really invest on the back of it. It just wasn't there. But I think it will be there in the next 10 years.
And then what about the sort of technical side of things? So is there anything in terms of your approaches to forestry or the farming or the specialist products you talked about that's been a realization that you can apply across the portfolio?
I think everything is very context specific and quite distinct. I'd say, I think that the principles around what a regenerative land management system looks like that we talked about, the foundation of soil health, working with nature, not against it, how can you have positive impacts on carbon biodiversity, their principles are common across everything we do. But then it quickly gets into specific land management systems, which are very much tailored to the ecosystem and the local circumstances. I think we are starting to try and put in place more common impact measurement reporting systems, where we can measure, report on carbon, we measure, report on biodiversity as much as we can. So I think that's where we put a lot of work in intellectually as a team. How do we have as much commonality as we can? But even that's got limitations, because an Irish forest will look very different from 200,000 hectares of grazing land in Australia.
It's so complicated to try and integrate the approach on things to certainly sort of the Article 9 fund type stuff with very strict impact reporting requirements. You're bringing in lots of different feeds and scenarios and processes into that framework. Yeah. That's got to be a heck of an intellectual challenge.
And it's why our strategy tend to be quite distinct funds and vehicles for each strategy. So we have US vehicles, you have European vehicles, Australian vehicles. They each have slightly different, let's say, impact targets and KPIs and slightly different ways in which you measure and report on those impacts as well. We do roll it all up to a kind of firm level impact report where we sort of aggregate as much as we can. But it really has to happen at the bottom level first to get granular and kind of really mean something.
Agreed. If we talk about risk for a moment, the, no pun intended, hot topic in the UK at the moment is wildfire risk. How much does that occupy your thinking in terms of your assets that you have?
Very little, to be honest. Like on the agricultural side, it's really not a factor. Like we invest heavily in Spain and Portugal in orchard crops, so tree nuts and olives. And we get that question a lot because people see the news and see the massive fires, but they tend not to affect agricultural areas. And they certainly tend not to affect irrigated orchards where you have water which you can turn on. It tends to affect actually abandoned agricultural land, which is semi-regenerated scrubland or forest. That's where it's actually happening. And then in the case of Ireland, it hasn't been an issue at all. I think storm damage is probably a bigger risk we see for forestry in the UK and Ireland, where Ireland was hit by a massive storm Éowyn in January, which probably wiped out about 3% of all Ireland's forests. So that was a major event. So that probably is a bigger issue, we think, in Northern Europe. Still, is storms versus compared to
one of my flippant lines to highlight the idiocy of the reporting is in the UK, I barely think wildfires exist. Every wildfire, you'll see the bottom of the news story, it's believed to be started by a barbecue or a cigarette. All of them. It wasn't a wildfire. Occasionally has some lightning hit something. Yes, it has. But everyone I talked to in the forestry world was like, we don't allow public access to our forest. That's why there's not a risk associated with it. That's a tension we have to bear because we are pro-public access to land. In Scotland, there's right to roam, of course, and we want to bring in ecotourism visitors. We're fortunate in the regard that the sort of paid visitors who choose to come and experience our estates do so from a certain knowledge base of not having barbecues or flames outside. So, I think like you, the storm risk, the sort of weather and climatic impacts present a greater risk, but are rarely asked about in comparison to the wildfires.
Right. Yeah, because they're visual. It gets in news headlines. Like that's what people tend to ask. What gets in the headlines.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned about allocations starting to change and evolve a bit. If we look forward 5 and 10 years, do you think we have hit a tipping point yet where we're going to see bigger natural capital allocations for everything ranging from farming to forestry to carbon and biodiversity?
I think so. Like every year we're seeing more and more big pension funds, insurance companies make these allocations. I think they're often starting with actually forestry. That seems to be the first place. Yeah. Because it's got a more established record, a track record as an asset class.
I almost describe it as a gateway drug to natural capital for people.
Yeah, completely, yeah. And then maybe agriculture, farmland, and then probably the last step is those pure environmental markets, based on carbon or biodiversity. But yeah, we've seen the allocations increase. We've seen people raise funds around this. You guys have done really well. Others, are in the space. So yeah, I don't see why that would not continue increasing year on year. And hopefully, as managers, we'll establish some good track record ourselves and we'll actually show investors you can make good returns out of this and have all the positive impacts. And then it becomes a snowball effect, because most investors don't want to come in first, they want to come second or third.
No one wants to be last.
Yeah, but they don't really last. Yeah, exactly. So once you get that snowball rolling, I think we'll see the investments increase over time.
One of the challenges you hear about a natural capital investment is the pace of things, and people want rapid returns. And I think it's only just now us and a few others in the UK that have started to explain to the environment sector that IRR matters based on speed and time. Whereas historically the environment sector just, let's slow it down, let's have another report, let's wait another year and view in the long game as opposed to the pace of getting an investor a return. How do you think you've so successfully managed to explain to people this isn't an immediate rush, it is a longer term investment, and still being successful with it?
I'd say that hasn't been such an issue for us, probably because the kinds of investors we've really focused in on and are working with are very long term, actually. You know, they're pension funds, insurance companies, they think in decadal terms. We've actually got almost the opposite pushback. We were raising a forestry fund in Europe and we had suggested like a 10-year term. And they said, well, why didn't you make it 15 or 20 years? Like 10 years is almost too short for them. So I think it all depends on who you talk to and what pools of capital that you speak to. Because on the other hand, if you speak to almost the wrong type of capital, more private equity, venture motivated, they want those 5-7 year returns. Maybe they also want double-digit IRRs. And I think that can be very hard to match with the realities of land, which tends to be, say, long-term, low return, lower risk, and a great diversifier. So you have to understand where it fits in an investor's portfolio and not try and make it do something it can't.
Do you think about, are there goals for the next chapter? Is there a number of AUM you want to hit? Is there different geographies? The next chapter of the business, what are your aspirations?
Yeah, I think we'll look to keep growing. Like as long as we can keep finding great strategies which work on the ground, great partners on the ground, so great farmers and foresters to work with. And that's probably the limiting factor actually in terms of pace and speed. Like we can only go as fast as there are regenerative farmers and foresters to work with.
And with those partners, do you think about the succession planning for those? Because in any other business, you'd be like, okay, we've got this amazing person, we can coach and develop a number two behind them and things. I guess it's hard to have that type of succession planning arrangement because, as you say, they're entrepreneurial people that you're partnering with.
Yeah, we've been quite lucky actually. We tend to work with younger farmers. Like for example, in the US, we did some analysis. I think the average age of farmers in our portfolio was around 35 years of age, and the US average age for all farmers is about 57.
I'd guess 60, so
So we are working with probably the younger generation anyway. Hopefully they got a good 20 plus years to go, so it won't be such an issue.
And actually, do you know what? You could do some really interesting things that you're probably going to extend the career of the farmer as well, because hopefully with the partnership you can bring in the additional support, the stress levels and the highs and lows, the edges of those will be taken off a little bit. So the accumulated demand on the farmer, you're going to be extending careers as well. So that'll be good for the sustainability side of things.
And hopefully make it an attractive career as well for the generation below them, like for their children. Because one of the big issues, no one wants to go into farming because you don't make any money, you're using all these chemicals. It's like a thankless sort of career, and you're always getting attacked by every environmentalist at the same time. So why would you do it? So we have to make this into an attractive career. You're growing food and like healthy, nutritious food in the right way. It's good for the land. You feel good about yourself, and you're profitable. And if we can build up those kind of lighthouse examples of successful, regenerative, profitable farmers, more people will copy them and come along and fill their shoes.
It's funny how you sharing a story or anecdote transports me back to somewhere else. We went to view an estate in the northwest of England, and this was a farmer who had got himself in a difficult spot. He'd borrowed massively to go from being a tenant farmer to buying it. Terrible interest rate. He'd done it at the wrong time. He was in a difficult spot. He was trying everything to make this farm work. He'd planted huge areas of maize on a salt marsh and had destroyed his own land, and it was going terribly. He had elderly relatives living on the farm. He had a daughter that did not want to go into farming. And we walked the estate with him to understand it. And he was talking. And at the same time, he desperately wanted his daughter to take on his farm, but he hated it so much. He was so happy she wasn't. Right. But you could see him bouncing between those emotions. So the exact thing you want to avoid, he was the living embodiment of everything that could go wrong in that environment. And then he suddenly decided that natural capital was going to be his solution to the sad thing about this estate. There was an opportunity to do managed realignment there and like have a wetland area. But the other play on it was a huge property development portfolio. But to trigger one, you had to give up the other. And the return on only half the solution just wouldn't have worked for anyone. So he was pretty stuck, bless him. But you took me straight back to that anecdote with that chap. Do you think about legacy? Because sat where I am, you've had a massive impact on this market. There's a pretty good chance I'm not talking. Well, has there ever been a natural capital focus day here before? Do you know?
Well, last year they did the second.
They did the second day.
Yeah, like maybe half a day.
Okay, but prior to your work, there's no way we'd be speaking here tomorrow.
No, like 5 years ago, wouldn't, definitely not.
No. So do you think about your legacy on the sector and
legacy is a big word. Like, we're just a small little piece. We're just pushing our
750 million's a big piece.
Yeah, we're pushing our bowl of dung, just slowly along, doing what we can.
Collecting beetles as you go.
Yeah. And hopefully the bowl gets bigger, as time goes by. So no, look, there are lots of people doing amazing work, and I think we are part of it. There is a community of other managers and investors and people with great startups like yourself. So I think there is a community, and there's more and more all the time, which is fantastic. Yeah. But yeah, 10, 15 years ago was a bit of a lonely task, but now I do feel all around there's new people popping up, and that's great. So there's momentum is building. I mean, legacy, look, we want to just keep growing the business, we'd like to impact more land. I think that's probably one met. Like, let's impact more hectares, more areas of land, regenerate more land, have that impact in soil health and carbon biodiversity. So that's certainly one thing we look at. But the other is, again, probably the people side. Like, how do we work with more great farmers and foresters? And exactly what we talked about. How do we make them successful and make it an attractive career for the next generation? That's the other side that we kind of measure, I think, progress or success.
You've been incredibly kind with your time. It's been a long day for you already. I've got about 50 other questions I'd love to ask. We're going to have to do a part 2, but I always end by asking, is there one question I haven't asked you wish I had?
That's a good one. We didn't get into the continuous cover forestry piece, and like just what it is and why it's so important and relevant. I don't know if we have a chance to kind of talk a bit more about
Let's
that.
do it. I would love to. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I talk a bit about we both talk about the downsides of conventional rotational forestry and how ugly and destructive it can be. But the idea that there is this other way of managing a forest where you can keep a forest intact, you don't clear fell, you selectively harvest, and over time, by letting in light, you promote natural regeneration, and you evolve this more diverse natural forest, which delivers timber, which we need, but also stores more carbon, is better for biodiversity, and looks nice. Like, it is achievable, and it's already been done. If you look at parts of Central Europe and Switzerland, Austria, Southern Germany, it's the norm.
In that composition, is there the potential to graze in some of those areas as well? Enough space.
That gets more complex. Actually, one of the biggest challenges to this continuous cover system is too many deer, actually.
Yeah.
So actually, deer management and having less grazing is probably a critical part if you want to promote regeneration, especially of broadleaves. If you want to get away from the pure conifers into a mixed species stand, you actually need to control grazing.
Herbivore management was one of the biggest challenges we've had in 2025. Not just logistically and operationally delivering, but public perception of that.
Yep.
And them not liking the fact it's happening.
Yeah.
Had a really interesting situation. We bought an estate in the Scottish borders that had a large population of feral goats. We had to deal with that situation, reduce numbers. We followed government guidance, everything you should. Push back locally. Well, we like looking at these goats. We don't want them to be culled. We got a lot of challenging correspondence with that. It took a lot of time and effort to resolve it. And actually, we just recruited for estate rangers there to support the team. And we hired 2 amazing new women who have come in, who literally said, we only knew about you as a business because of the amount of negative pushback you got on this. We were so happy that you were doing the right thing for the environment. We want to become part of the business. Yeah. We had no idea it was going to help our recruitment when we were in the dark days of dealing with.
I think we need to completely change our attitude towards hunting. And during COVID, when things were kind of going a bit weird, a side project I had was writing another book, and I wrote a book by the history of Irish woodlands. And one of the sections I wrote, a paragraph was like, we need to shoot more deer.
Yeah.
That's coming from a passionate environmentalist and animal lover, but we need to educate people that we do need to kill more animals to restore the health of our forests. And that's a tough one, but people need to get their head around that. We are the keystone species now. We don't have wolves, we don't have predators. So if we're not going to have them, it's on us as humans if we're going to have a healthy ecosystem.
I've literally wrote a less eloquent version of that paragraph. I talk about the biggest privilege and challenge of what I do is dealing with the contradictions and the compromises. I don't want to kill anything. I won't kill a spider. I won't kill a fly. We put the glass over the spider and remove it from the living room when they're in there. But hundreds, if not thousands of deer and goats and herbivores have been killed at my direction and with me signing the check.
Yeah.
And that makes me a hypocrite. And I've got to live with that. But the reality is we didn't create the situation and the balance and lack thereof in the environment. We can either choose to be part of the solution or not. And that's what we're trying to do, but in a respectful way. And we keep as much of the venison in the food system as possible. One of the brilliant lines about these goats was, so we made no profit. So we said, look, we will sell this into the local game dealer at cost. We want this meat to go back to the community. Local paper runs a headline that we're force feeding goat to the local community. It's like, well, they're going to the butchers and buying it.
Yeah.
We're not force feeding
Yeah.
it to anyone. It's a journey. It's a journey. I think we touched on it with you about the biggest challenges of going early was on the fundraising side of stuff. Ours have been on the regulatory side in that we're going to have the 4 biggest native woodland creation projects in Scotland in the next year or so. They hadn't considered how that would happen at the same time with the same organisation. You know, things like even the accounting standards that have just been changed in the UK to recognise revenue from carbon doesn't work. It doesn't fit. The same with BNG. It doesn't allow you to actually, you can have the cash sat in your account, but it doesn't allow you to recognise it yet.
Right.
So things like that, a bit like if you wanted to raise significant grant funding against a piece of land that had borrowing associated with it, well, both the grant funder and the provider of the debt package both want first charge on a title.
Yeah.
You can't give them both first.
Right.
But the grant funders have never expected this to be done at scale before.
Yeah.
So every week we're getting another one of these systems we're having to explain to people, no, this is a commercial enterprise that's happening at scale and at pace. And yeah, I always think the military analogy, the first people through the wall get bloody. And some of these are a bit bloody at the moment.
Yeah.
That was an absolute treat.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Really
Yeah,
appreciate
that's
it.
great.